Get away from her, you wicked woman. Nadia, Gonghui's caregiver, shouted, her voice loud, fierce, and full, filling the room from wall to wall, because some things needed to be said at volume. She lunged forward, dragging Seo-yoon, Gyeonghui's son's fiancée, off Gyeonghui, the 65-year-old woman tied to a chair. Seo-yoon hit the ground with a crash that knocked the glass from her hand, sending it shattering against the leg of the chair. Alcohol spread across the floor in a dark, sharp-smelling stain. Seo-yoon, 27, was engaged to Tae-oh, Gyeonghui's son. For 2 years, she had been maltreating and bullying Gyeonghui, who suffered from dementia, and had been getting away with it, until Nadia, a newly hired caregiver, arrived under unexpected circumstances and finally stood up for her. Seo-yoon got to her feet, her face twisting into something sharp, furious, and very, very dangerous as she took a step forward. Nadia slapped her. Clean. Decisive. With the full conviction of a woman who had just witnessed an elderly, defenseless person tied to a chair. The sound rang off the walls like a door slamming shut on something that should have been shut long ago. Seo-yoon staggered, but Nadia struck again, sending her back to the floor, less gently than before. Then Nadia stepped in front of her, planted her feet, and looked down with an expression that said, plainly and without drama, that she was prepared to do this as many times as necessary. Stay down, Nadia said. Her chest heaved, her hands trembled slightly with adrenaline, but her eyes were steady, terrifyingly steady. If you're still here, it means you're hooked and want to see how this story unfolds. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment. Nadia was heading to an interview when she spotted a frightened elderly woman sitting on a bench in the street in the rain, her clothes soaked and her feet bare. She stopped walking, looked around at the people passing by, and not one of them slowed down. She crossed the street. The second she got close, the woman launched herself backward on the bench, eyes blown wide, hands up, a sharp sound ripping out of her throat like Nadia was holding a weapon. Nadia froze with both hands raised, standing in the rain like a hostage, her heart knocking against her ribs. Okay, I'm literally just... The woman pressed herself against the bench armrest and stared, her chest heaving and her eyes jumping everywhere, her white hair flat against her face and her floral blouse soaked through, like someone had just dropped her here from another world. Nadia crouched down slowly, dropping to eye level, keeping every movement deliberate and soft. The woman flinched again, and something in Nadia's chest pulled tight. I know, Nadia said softly, keeping her voice low and even. I know, I'm scary, 6 feet tall, soaking wet, no umbrella, I completely get it. The woman stared at her, trembling and unconvinced. I'm Nadia, she said, pointing at herself, then waiting with more patience than she knew she had. Nothing came back, only the rain and the traffic and a pigeon with absolutely no survival instincts waddling between them. She pointed at the woman, and held the silence. Gyeonghui, the woman finally whispered, like the name had cost her something. Nadia asked why she was sitting in the rain and where she lived, but the woman only clutched her hands and shook her head frantically when asked for her address, her eyes filling with something that looked less like stubbornness and more like genuine terror at not knowing the answer herself. Nadia recognized the signs immediately, felt the pieces click quietly and sadly into place, then redirected the foot traffic around them and gently walked her toward the nearest police station. 4 blocks became 20 minutes, and Nadia did not rush a single second of it. Gyeonghui stopped twice to stare at things that weren't there, her eyes fixed on some private distance that Nadia couldn't reach, and both times Nadia waited beside her, holding her inside-out umbrella over the woman's head and taking the rain fully on herself. A man had to walk around them on the pavement, and he made sure they both knew it with a long, theatrical sigh. Nadia turned and looked at him with the specific expression she reserved for difficult patients and difficult people, and he walked considerably faster after that. The desk officer was young and had been halfway through an egg sandwich when they walked in, and he set it down the moment he saw them both standing there, dripping quietly onto his floor. She was outside alone, no ID, no phone, and I'm a nurse, it's dementia, Nadia said, and then paused for just a beat. She also likes butterscotch, if that helps. He stared at them both for a moment, seeming to weigh several responses at once. I'll get my supervisor, he said. They were given plastic chairs to sit on, weak tea to drink, and a blanket someone had found for Gyeonghui, which she accepted without looking up. Gyeonghui held the cup with both hands and stared at the wall, still and quiet in the way of someone whose thoughts had taken them somewhere no one else could follow. Nadia scrolled through missing persons reports, her wet thumb dragging across the screen, her jaw set with quiet determination. An hour passed, heavy and slow. Then Gyeonghui reached over with no warning and patted Nadia's hand once, firm and deliberate, before looking away like she hadn't done it at all. Nadia looked at her for a long moment, feeling something settle warmly in her chest, then looked back at her phone and kept scrolling. A policeman walked in, stopped mid-stride, and immediately recognized Gyeonghui, bowing to her with visible respect, though she didn't respond or look up. He turned to his colleagues with an expression caught somewhere between shock and alarm, and lowered his voice to tell them that she was Madame Hui, the mother of Tayo, chairman of the Choi Group. The officers straightened almost in unison, then turned to inform Nadia of the development before moving quickly to contact the Choi family directly. Nadia started humming without quite meaning to, a low and familiar melody that belonged to her mother and to late nights and to very tired bones. Gyeonghui turned and stared at her like she had grown a second head right there in the waiting area of a police station. Nadia kept going, feeling slightly self-conscious but refusing to stop, because the woman's shoulders had dropped 2 full inches and that was reason enough. Then, quietly, and completely off-key, in an entirely different melody and utterly unbothered by the difference, Gyeonghui hummed back. The sun came around the corner moving fast, his hair wet with no umbrella, his eyes already searching the room before he was fully through the door. He saw her, and his face just fell open, every hour of fear draining out of it all at once. He crossed the room in seconds, crouched in front of her, and put both hands gently on her face, his voice dropping low and cracking quietly at the edges as he spoke to her in Korean. Gyeonghui touched his cheek and said his name, soft and certain, like it was one thing she hadn't lost. Nadia looked down at her phone, blinking once, then twice, because something was absolutely in her eye and it was entirely unrelated to anything happening 3 feet away from her. You stayed the whole time. She looked up to find him standing beside her, looking down at her with an expression she couldn't quite name. She was scared, Nadia said simply, meeting his eyes. It didn't feel right to leave. He nodded slowly, his jaw working with the particular effort of a man holding himself together after hours of being terrified, now that the terror had finally, mercifully stopped. Tayo, he said quietly. Choi Tayo. Nadia, she said. His mother tugged his sleeve then, said something short and pointed in Korean, and looked at Nadia with great expectation. He looked at Nadia, and something moved at the corner of his mouth. She says you sing badly. Nadia laughed, full and real and the best thing she'd felt all day. Gyeonghui looked extremely, profoundly satisfied with herself. But, he added, his voice dropping quieter, she says it helped. Nadia glanced at her phone, felt her stomach drop, and realized with a small, breathless panic that she was somehow still late for her interview. She told them quickly that she had to go, grabbed her bag and her broken umbrella, and was out the door before anyone could properly say goodbye. When she arrived at the hospital, damp and slightly windswept, she explained what had happened and why she was late, and the interviewer nodded along with a pleasant and entirely non-committal expression. She didn't get the job. She knew it when he smiled with only his mouth, when he said we'll be in touch in that careful, final tone, knew it before she even reached the door. Nadia stood on the steps outside with her broken umbrella and no job offer, and felt, against every reasonable expectation, completely fine, better than fine, in a way she couldn't explain and didn't try to. She walked, and she didn't look back. If you're still here, it means you love this story. Please subscribe, like and comment. The call came at 7:43 in the morning, while Nadia was eating cereal that had gone soft because she'd been staring at her bank statement for too long. Her phone started ringing. She didn't recognize the number, but she picked up anyway, because hope was free and cereal was already ruined. Miss Nadia, the voice said, low and controlled, like a man who had learned very early that volume was for people who had something to prove. This is Choi Tayo. She put her spoon down. I'd like to offer you a position as my mother's private caregiver, effective immediately, live-in, full accommodation provided. He paused for exactly 1 second. Name your price. Nadia looked at her bank statement, then at her soft cereal, then at the crack in her ceiling she'd been meaning to report to the landlord for 4 months. I'll text you my rate, she said. Double it, he said, and hung up. She sat with the phone in her hand for a long moment, and then she picked her spoon back up, because she was going to need the energy. She learned later, through the careful, tiptoeing whispers of the house staff, what had happened the morning after she'd brought Gyeonghua home. Tayo had gathered every person whose job touched his mother, the caregiver, the gate attendant, the housekeeper on duty, the 2 guards on the east wing, and he had stood in the middle of the main hall with the particular stillness of a man who had already made every decision and simply required their presence to deliver it. He didn't raise his voice once. He didn't need to. You had one responsibility, he said, and that was apparently all he said, because by 10 o'clock the house had been cleared of 6 members of staff with their final checks and their personal items in boxes. The caregiver, Mrs. Park, a woman who had worked in the Choi house for 3 years, stood at the door and said, "Sir, please, if you'd only let me explain," and Tayo said, "Your explanation is in the envelope," and walked back inside. What none of them knew, what Tayo did not know, what the dismissed staff could not prove because no one had seen it, was that Mrs. Park had been in the kitchen making Gyeonghui's morning tea at the exact moment the estate gate swung open. She had not opened it. She had not been anywhere near it. On the east corridor, at 6:52 that morning, a pair of heels clicked away from the gate panel with quick, deliberate steps, and their owner smiled at her own reflection in the hallway mirror as she passed it. Seo-yoon always did have excellent timing. The Choi estate sat behind iron gates on a hill that made the rest of the city look like a sketch someone had drawn and left unfinished, and when the car pulled through those gates on Nadia's first morning, she pressed her face almost to the window like a child and decided immediately that she would not let anyone see her do that. The house was enormous and pale and surrounded by the kind of garden that required its own full-time staff just to look effortlessly natural. "Your room is in the east wing," the housekeeper, Mrs. Yoon, told her at the door, with the expression of a woman professionally committed to neutrality. "Madam's room is directly across the hall." "Perfect," Nadia said, taking in the entrance hall, the high ceilings, the staircase that swept upward like it was trying to be a statement. A small sound came from the top of the stairs. Gyeonghui stood there in a pale blue robe, her white hair loose around her shoulders, staring down at Nadia with the careful, uncertain squint of someone trying to place a face they almost knew. Nadia lifted her hand and waved, slow and easy. Something shifted in the old woman's face, not full recognition, but the warmth that came before it, the feeling before the memory. She pointed at Nadia from the top of the stairs and said something in Korean, short and definitive. Mrs. Yoon made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. "She says," Mrs. Yoon said, composing herself admirably, "that you're the one who sings like a sad cat." Nadia pressed her lips together, looked up at Gyeonghui, and nodded with all the dignity she had left. "That's me," she said. "Your sad cat has arrived." Gyeonghui looked deeply satisfied and shuffled back down the hallway, apparently considering the matter settled. By the end of the first week, Nadia had learned several things. She had learned that Gyeonghui took her tea with 2 sugars and would accept nothing else, and would make her feelings on the matter known with impressive clarity for a woman whose words came and went like weather. She had learned that Gyeonghui liked the garden in the late morning, liked game shows she couldn't entirely follow, liked having her hair brushed in the evenings, and liked slipping butterscotch candies into Nadia's coat pocket like she was feeding a stray she'd adopted. She had also learned that every time a particular pair of heels clicked down the hallway outside Gyeonghui's room, something happened to the old woman that Nadia could not immediately name. It started in the shoulders. They came up, slow and involuntary, the way a child's shoulders rose when they heard a door slam in another room. Then the hands, which would find each other in Gyeonghui's lap and hold on. Then the eyes, which went somewhere inward and careful and closed off, like a house shutting its windows before a storm. Nadia noticed it the second time it happened, catalogued it quietly the third time, and by the fourth time she was watching the door. Seo-yoon was the kind of beautiful that announced itself before she entered a room, and she knew it, and she used it the way other people use paperwork, efficiently, and to get things done. She smiled at Nadia on their first meeting with every tooth accounted for, took her hand, and said, "We are so grateful for what you did, truly," in a voice that was warm enough to sound sincere and smooth enough to be neither. "Gyeonghui is so important to all of us," she added, her hand still holding Nadia's, her eyes making a brief, efficient assessment that started at Nadia's shoes and ended at her face. "She's doing well," Nadia said pleasantly, giving nothing. Seo-yoon smiled again, let go of her hand, and glided away down the corridor, and Nadia stood there for a moment and felt the specific unease of a person who has been smiled at and cannot prove why it felt like something else entirely. She heard it on a Tuesday, when she came back from the garden 10 minutes earlier than expected because Gyeonghui had wanted her cardigan and Nadia had gone to fetch it. The door to Gyeonghui's sitting room was not fully closed, and Seo-yoon's voice came through the gap, low and sweet and perfectly controlled, the way poison came in small bottles. "You don't even remember, do you?" Seo-yoon was saying, not as a question, her voice carrying the soft, intimate cruelty of someone who had learned exactly how far they could go with someone who wouldn't remember it tomorrow. "You never remember anything, Madam Hui, which is honestly such a mercy for you, isn't it?" because imagine having to remember being such a burden. Nadia's hand stopped on the door handle. Tayo is tired, Seo-yoon continued, her tone shifting to something almost tender, which was somehow worse. He won't say it to your face because he's a good son, but I see it. I see how much it costs him every single day, watching you like this, worrying about you like this. It's a weight, you know, that he carries entirely because of you. A silence. Then a small sound, low and bewildered, the sound of someone reaching for something they can't find, a word or a memory or a way to argue back, and finding nothing, nothing, nothing. Gyeong-hui's voice, when it came, was thin and lost. Tayo is not coming, Seo-yoon said, pleasantly. He's busy, because someone has to run the company while you wander around frightening people. Nadia pushed the door open. Seo-yoon turned with the seamlessness of someone who had spent years being walked in on and had prepared for every version of it, her expression moving from one thing to another so fast that a less watchful person would have missed the transition entirely. Nadia, she said warmly, her hand resting on the back of Gyeong-hui's chair with a gentleness that had appeared from nowhere. I was just keeping her company. Gyeong-hui was sitting with both hands pressed flat to her knees and her eyes on the floor, her whole body held in the small, contracted posture of someone who had been made to feel that taking up space was something they needed to apologize for. There was a mark on her wrist. Not dramatic, not unmissable, a red pressure mark, the kind left by fingers that had held on too tight for too long, and Nadia clocked it in the same half-second that she kept her face completely, professionally still. Thank you, Nadia said to Seo-yoon, stepping fully into the room and setting the cardigan around Gyeong-hui's shoulders, letting her hands rest there for a moment, warm and deliberate. I've got her from here. Seo-yoon looked at her for just a beat longer than was comfortable, then smiled, and left. The heels clicked away down the corridor. Gyeong-hui's shoulders didn't drop until the sound was completely gone. Nadia crouched in front of her and said nothing for a moment, just looked at her, this small and bewildered woman who could not hold on to her own memories long enough to build a case against the person dismantling her from the inside, who woke up every morning and lost the previous day like water through her hands, and who still, every single evening, saved a butterscotch candy for the woman across the hall. Gyeong-hui, Nadia said softly, look at me. The old woman looked up, and her eyes were wet and uncertain and deeply, quietly ashamed, the shame of someone who couldn't explain why they felt so small. Nadia took her hands gently, turned the one with the mark face up, and looked at it without expression. Did someone hurt you? She asked carefully, simply, the way you asked a question you already knew the answer to but needed her to feel safe enough to confirm. Gyeong-hui looked at her wrist, then at Nadia, then back at her wrist, her brow furrowed with the enormous effort of trying to hold a thread that kept slipping. I don't, she started, and stopped, and the frustration of not being able to finish crossed her face like a shadow. I don't remember. Nadia nodded slowly, held her hand a moment longer, then sat beside her on the chair and didn't move. That's okay, she said, keeping her voice even and warm, even as something cold and sharp was settling in her chest with quiet, absolute certainty. You don't have to remember. Nadia would remember for her. That night, she sat at the small desk in her room across the hall, and she opened a new notes file on her phone, and she began to document every single thing she had seen, with dates and times and descriptions, in the careful, precise language of a woman who had spent years writing patient notes and knew exactly what evidence looked like before anyone called it that. The mark on the left wrist, she typed, the flinching at the sound of heels in the corridor, the way Gyeong-hui held her breath when a certain door opened, and the things Seo-yoon had said in that sitting room, every word that Nadia had heard through a gap in a door and would not be forgetting. She had taken this job to care for one woman. She was beginning to understand that the job was going to be considerably more complicated than that. Across the hall, Gyeong-hui slept, and in her sleep she was calm, because whatever her mind lost in the daylight hours, it at least gave her the mercy of rest, and for now, Nadia thought, that would have to be enough. For now. Please subscribe, like and comment if you are feeling the story. The camera was the size of a shirt button, and it cost Nadia 3 days of her new salary, and she did not regret a single penny of it. She fixed it to the spine of the small wooden clock on Gyeong-hui's bedside table on a Thursday morning, while the old woman sat behind her eating butterscotch and offering a running commentary in Korean that Nadia couldn't understand but chose to interpret as encouragement. Almost done, Nadia murmured, adjusting the angle with her thumbnail, checking the feed on her phone, repositioning by 2 degrees, then checking again. Gyeong-hui leaned forward and peered at the clock with great suspicion, then peered at Nadia, then back at the clock. She said something short and pointed. It's just a clock, Nadia said. Gyeong-hui said something else, longer this time, with the tone of a woman who had lived 65 years and was not remotely fooled. A very good clock, Nadia agreed, and stood up, and the matter was apparently settled, because Gyeonghui offered her a butterscotch and moved on. The footage from the first 2 days was ordinary enough. Gyeonghui napping, Gyeonghui talking to the window, Mrs. Yoon bringing meals, Nadia herself crossing in and out of frame like a long-limbed shadow, and Nadia watched it every evening at her desk with the particular patience of a woman who knew that people like Seo Yoon did not stop, they only waited until they thought no one was looking. She did not have to wait long. The notification came on the 3rd day, on a Wednesday afternoon, while Nadia was in the kitchen supervising Gyeonghui's lunch preparation, making absolutely sure the soup was not too salty because the cook, God bless him, had heavy hands and strong opinions about flavor. Her phone buzzed with a motion alert, and she glanced at the thumbnail, and every thought in her head went completely quiet. She looked at the cook. "Turn the heat down and don't let it boil," she said, in a voice so calm it belonged to a different moment entirely, and she was already moving toward the door before the sentence was finished. She heard Gyeonghui before she saw her. A thin, frightened sound coming through the door of the sitting room, the sound of someone trying to say no with a mouth that someone else's hand was working against, wet and desperate and small, and beneath it the low, pleasant murmur of Seo Yoon's voice saying something soothing and terrible in the tone of a person who had done this before and expected to finish. Nadia pushed the door open. What she saw stopped her for exactly half a second, which was all the time she allowed herself, because half a second was what it took to see everything and decide. Gyeonghui was in the chair by the window, her thin wrists bound together in her lap with a silk scarf pulled tight, her eyes wide and streaming and darting desperately toward the door as it opened, her mouth being forced open by Seo Yoon's fingers while Seo Yoon's other hand tipped a glass of amber liquid toward her lips with the calm efficiency of someone who had a system for this. Gyeonghui's legs were kicking weakly against the floor, pushing back, her whole small body trying to refuse what her hands couldn't fight and her voice couldn't stop. Seo Yoon didn't even look up at first, because she was used to not being interrupted. Nadia crossed the room in 4 steps, grabbed Seo Yoon by the shoulder, and put her on the floor. It was not graceful, and Nadia did not intend it to be. Seo Yoon hit the ground with a crash that knocked the glass from her hand and sent it shattering against the leg of the chair, and the alcohol spread across the floor in a dark, sharp-smelling stain, and Seo Yoon looked up from the ground with an expression that cycled through shock and outrage and something very much like fear before settling on outrage as the most useful option. "Get away from her," Nadia said, and her voice came out loud and fierce and full, filling the room from wall to wall, because some things needed to be said at volume. "Get away from her, you wicked woman, get away from her right now." Gyeonghui was making a broken, trembling sound in the chair, her bound hands pressed to her chest, her eyes fixed on Nadia with the raw and desperate relief of someone who had stopped believing rescue was coming. Seo Yoon got to her feet, and her face had reorganized itself into something sharp and furious and very, very dangerous, and she took a step forward. Nadia slapped her. Clean and decisive and with the full conviction of a woman who had watched an elderly, defenseless person be tied to a chair, the sound of it rang off the walls like a door slamming shut on something that should have been shut a long time ago. Seo Yoon staggered, and Nadia put her on the floor again, less gently than the first time, and then Nadia stepped in front of her and planted both feet and looked down at her with an expression that said, plainly and without drama, that she was prepared to do this as many times as necessary. "Stay down," Nadia said, and her chest was heaving and her hands were shaking slightly with adrenaline, but her eyes were completely, terrifyingly steady. The commotion brought the house running. Mrs. Yoon arrived at the door first, took in the scene, Seo Yoon on the floor, Gyeonghui tied to the chair, Nadia standing between them like a wall that had decided to have a personality, and quietly stepped to the side. Tayo came 30 seconds later, moving fast, throwing the door the rest of the way open, his eyes going immediately to Seo Yoon on the ground, and his whole face shifting with alarm. "What is?" Seo Yoon burst into tears. It was immediate and impressive, the tears arriving with the speed and volume of a woman who kept them on standby for exactly this kind of emergency, and she reached toward Tayo from the floor with both hands, her voice breaking on cue into something soft and devastated. "Tayo, I came in and she was, Nadia was hurting her, she had her tied up, I tried to stop her and she attacked me, she pushed me, I don't know what she was doing to her but I came in and—" "Oh, that is extraordinary," Nadia said, with the tone of a woman who genuinely, despite everything, could not help but admire the scale of the attempt. Tayo turned to look at Nadia, and his jaw was set and his eyes were hard, and Nadia could see him calculating, assembling the scene in the order he'd walked into it, and she could see exactly where that calculation was going wrong. Then his eyes moved to his mother. Gang-hui was still in the chair, her small wrist still bound together in her lap with Seo-yoon's silk scarf, and she was shaking her head, back and forth, frantically and continuously, the single clearest word available to a woman whose words kept failing her, and her eyes were fixed on Seo-yoon with an expression so raw and so afraid that it could not have been performed by anyone, least of all a woman who sometimes forgot what day it was. The room went very still. Tayo looked at his mother's bound wrists, and something in his face changed in a way that had no name and needed none, and Nadia watched him and said nothing because some things needed a moment to land. A vein moved in his jaw. His hands, at his sides, closed slowly into fists. She did this, Nadia said quietly, and pointed at Seo-yoon, not with drama but with the plain, level certainty of a woman who was done being careful and cautious and patient about it. I have evidence. Tayo looked at her, his face stripped of everything except the effort of staying controlled. Nadia had her phone out already, and she set it on the table and pressed play, and the room watched the screen. The footage was clear and unhurried and absolutely, irreversibly damning. Seo-yoon entering the room with the glass and the scarf, her movements practiced and deliberate, Gang-hui's face when she saw what was coming, the binding of her wrists, the forced opening of her mouth, every second of it recorded and timestamped and stored in a cloud server that Nadia had set up specifically because she had known, with the bone-deep certainty of a nurse who had seen patterns before they became crises, that this moment was coming. I put the camera in because I needed proof, Nadia said, keeping her voice level and clear. Because I knew that without it, this is exactly what would happen, and I was standing right here and she still tried it. The footage kept playing. Seo-yoon, on the floor, had stopped crying. Her face had gone the particular color of someone who has just watched the last exit close. Tayo reached over and stopped the video, and he stood there for a moment with his hand flat on the table and his head slightly bowed, and the room was so quiet that the tick of the small wooden clock on the bedside table was the loudest thing in it. Then he straightened, and he looked at Seo-yoon, and he opened his mouth, and what came out was not loud, because he had never needed volume to be the most serious person in a room. Get out of my house, he said. Tayo, Seo-yoon started, getting to her feet, her voice recovering its texture and softness, reaching for the version of herself that had always worked on him before, the gentle and the persuasive and the perfectly pitched. Tayo, listen to me, that video isn't, you can't just. I'm calling the police, he said, and he was already taking out his phone, and his voice had the flat, absolute quality of a door that has been not just closed but locked and bolted. And I am calling my lawyer, and I am ending our engagement, and I am asking you, for the last time, to get out of my house. The word engagement landed in the room like something physical. Seo-yoon stared at him, and for one unguarded moment her face showed something underneath all its careful layers. Not remorse, nothing as useful or human as that, but the specific, furious shock of someone who had played a very long game and could not understand how they had lost it. She looked at Nadia. Nadia looked back at her, calm and immovable and not remotely sorry. Seo-yoon picked up her bag from the floor, straightened her clothes with hands that were not quite steady, and walked out of the room, and her heels clicked down the corridor for the last time, and the sound got smaller and smaller until it was gone entirely. Mrs. Yoon untied Gang-hui's wrists with hands that shook slightly, and the moment the scarf came away Nadia was there, sitting beside her, taking both her small hands in her own and chafing them gently, checking the marks, checking her pulse at the wrist with 2 fingers and a trained eye. Gang-hui's breathing was ragged and thin and she was trembling from her shoulders all the way down, and she looked at Nadia with the eyes of someone who had been somewhere very frightening and had just been pulled back from it. It's done, Nadia said softly, holding her hands and not letting go. It's done, she's gone, you're safe, I've got you. Gang-hui stared at her for a long moment, her chest still juddering with the aftermath of fear, and then she turned and looked at her son standing in the middle of the room with his phone in his hand and his fiancée's absence still settling around him like dust after a collapse. She said his name. He crossed the room and crouched in front of her, and he took her hands from Nadia's, gently and deliberately, and he looked at her wrists where the scarf had been, and Nadia watched something move across his face that was not something she should be watching because it was too private and too enormous and too much his alone. He said something to his mother in Korean, low and broken at the edges. Gang-hui reached up with both hands and held his face, the way she had in the police station, certain and gentle, and she said something back to him that made his eyes close. Nadia stood up quietly and walked to the window and looked at the garden, giving them the room without leaving it, because Gang-hui's hands were still shaking and she wasn't going anywhere just yet. The police came within the hour, and Nadia gave her statement with the camera footage loaded and the documentation on her phone open and organized and dated going back to the first week. and the officers looked at it with the expressions of people who had not expected this level of preparation but were grateful for it. Seo-yoon's lawyer called before she had even left the street, and Taeyo's lawyer was already on a conference call by the time the police car pulled away, and the house moved around all of it with the particular controlled energy of a place that was used to crises but not quite used to this one. Through it all, Nadia sat with Ga-eun-hui in her room, and they watched a game show that Ga-eun-hui couldn't quite follow and Nadia definitely couldn't, and at some point Ga-eun-hui produced a butterscotch from somewhere inside her cardigan sleeve. She had an apparently inexhaustible supply secreted about her person at all times, which Nadia had stopped questioning, and pressed it into Nadia's hand with a firm, proprietary air. "Thank you," Nadia said. Ga-eun-hui patted her knee and said something in Korean, short and certain. "I'll take that as you're welcome," Nadia said. Ga-eun-hui made a sound that was approximately a scoff, and went back to the game show, which seemed to involve people spinning things and being very excited about it, and Nadia unwrapped the butterscotch and put it in her mouth and thought that for a day that had involved a physical altercation, a camera reveal, a broken engagement, and a police report, it had ended in a remarkably reasonable place. She was standing in the hallway outside Ga-eun-hui's room, rolling her shoulder. She had put a woman on the floor twice and her body had opinions about it, when Taeyo came around the corner. He stopped when he saw her. She stopped when she saw him. He looked, for the first time since she had met him, like a man who did not entirely know what to do with his hands. "How is she?" Nadia asked. "Sleeping," he said. "Finally." He paused, and the pause had a great deal of weight in it. The doctor came. "He says she's okay, she's not." He stopped, and pressed his mouth together briefly, and started again. "She'll be okay." "She will," Nadia agreed, and meant it completely. He looked at her for a moment, and she could see him assembling something, working toward words that were giving him trouble, which he suspected was not a state he occupied often. "I dismissed people," he said, "who did nothing wrong, while the person who—" He stopped again. "I didn't see it, and it was right in front of me, and I didn't." "You see it now," Nadia said, simply and without judgment, because guilt was only useful up to the point where it became the story instead of the lesson. He looked at her, and something in his expression shifted, something that was complicated and quiet and not yet anything with a name, and Nadia looked back at him steadily and thought that this was a conversation that had more chapters in it than tonight could hold. "Get some rest," she said, and turned toward her room. "Nadia." She looked back. He was still standing in the hallway, and the light was low and the house was finally quiet and his mother was sleeping safely across the hall, and he said, "Thank you," in a voice that carried the full weight of what those two words were being asked to hold. Nadia looked at him for a moment. "That's what I'm here for," she said, and went inside, and closed the door, and stood with her back against it in the dark for a long moment, listening to the silence of a house that felt, for the first time since she'd arrived, like it was exhaling. Across the hall, Ga-eun-hui slept without flinching. Please subscribe, like and comment. I love seeing how far this story travels. The house was different without Seo-yoon in it, and it took Nadia 3 days to identify exactly what the difference was. It was quieter, but not in the way that empty things were quiet. It was quiet the way a room was quiet after someone opened a window, the kind of quiet that had a moving through it, that had breathing room and light, that made you realize how much space a particular presence had been consuming without anyone granting it permission. Mrs. Yoon hummed in the kitchen now, which she apparently had always wanted to do and never had. The cook made soup with the exact right amount of salt, which Nadia suspected was also not a coincidence. And Ga-eun-hui, who had spent weeks with her shoulders up around her ears like a woman braced for weather, started sitting in the garden with her hands open in her lap, which was the most peaceful thing Nadia had ever seen, and she had seen a great many peaceful things in her career. Taeyo began eating breakfast at home. This was apparently, according to Mrs. Yoon, delivered in the hushed tones of someone reporting a significant historical event, not something he had done with any regularity in years. He had always left early, always returned late, always had the particular rhythm of a man who kept himself very busy on purpose. Now he was at the breakfast table at 7:30 in the morning, in a shirt that was slightly less formal than his usual ones, with his sleeves rolled to the elbow and his coffee going cold because he was watching his mother attempt to teach Nadia to use chopsticks. It was not going well. "I have them," Nadia said, with great confidence, picking up a piece of fruit and watching it immediately escape and bounce across the table. Ga-eun-hui made a sound of profound disappointment and snatched the chopsticks back, demonstrating the correct grip for the 4th time with the patience of a woman who had made her peace with the fact that this was going to take a while. "She says," Taeyo offered from behind his coffee cup, "that you hold them like you're trying to stab something." I am trying to stab something, Nadia said, pointing at the fruit, which had rolled to a stop near his plate. That, specifically. Tayo picked it up with his own chopsticks, effortlessly, without looking, which was frankly unnecessary, and held it out to her. She looked at it, then at him. You're showing off, she said. I'm helping, he said, and his eyes were doing something quiet and amused above the coffee cup, and Nadia took the fruit off the chopsticks and ate it and decided not to examine the fact that her ears had gone slightly warm. Gyeonghui watched the entire exchange and said something to herself that had the cadence of someone filing information away for later. The gift started on a Tuesday, and they started subtly, which was almost worse. She came back from her morning walk with Gyeonghui to find a small package on her desk with no note, wrapped in plain paper, and inside it was a pair of nurse's compression socks in exactly her size and exactly the shade of green she'd once mentioned, in passing, to no one in particular, was her favorite color. She held them up and looked at them for a long time. She did not bring it up at dinner. He did not bring it up at dinner. But when she passed him in the hallway afterward, she said, "The socks are lovely, thank you," without breaking stride, and he said, "I don't know what socks," without breaking his, and she laughed to herself all the way to her room. The second gift was less subtle. She came downstairs one morning to find a brand new umbrella sitting beside her bag by the door, a proper one, solid and elegant and a very dark green, and she looked at it, then looked at Tayo, who was standing at the kitchen counter reading something on his phone with the determined focus of a man extremely interested in his email. "Tayo," she said. He said. "There's an umbrella." "There are many umbrellas in the world," he said, turning a page he was not reading. "This one is new and it's green and it's next to my bag." "Remarkable," he said. She picked it up, tested its weight, opened it once and closed it again, and it was the best umbrella she had ever held in her life, solid and smooth and nothing at all like the inside-out disaster she had carried for 3 years. She put it back down by her bag and said nothing else, and he continued not reading his email, and they had both absolutely completely failed to have a conversation about it. Gyeonghui, sitting at the kitchen table eating her breakfast, watched all of this and said something to Mrs. Yoon in Korean. Mrs. Yoon covered her smile with her hand. They developed a habit, by accident, or something dressed as accident, of ending up in the garden at the same time in the evenings. It started because Nadia was there with Gyeonghui, and then Gyeonghui fell asleep in the garden chair at 7 o'clock as she sometimes did, and Nadia didn't want to move her until she stirred naturally, and Tayo came out and sat in the other chair because his mother was there, and then the sun went down and Gyeonghui was still asleep and somehow neither of them went inside. They talked, the first evening, about practical things, Gyeonghui's new medication schedule, the appointment next week with the neurologist, whether the night nurse who came 3 times a week was working out. The second evening they talked about less practical things. She told him about Ward 4B, about the job she didn't get on the day she found his mother, about the specific career purgatory of being overqualified and underemployed, and he listened with the full, unhurried attention of someone who had things to say but understood that listening was the better thing to do right now. He told her about his father, who had died when Tayo was 26 and left him a company and no instruction manual, and about the years that followed, which had been years of getting things right by getting them wrong first, and Nadia listened and understood without saying so, which was sometimes the only understanding that meant anything. "You were 26, she said, "and you ran a company." "Badly, at first," he said. "But you did it," she said. He looked at her sideways in the evening light, and she looked back, and the garden was very still around them, and Gyeonghui slept between them in her chair like a small, contented bridge. "You were a stranger," he said quietly, "and you sat in a police station for 3 hours holding my mother's hand." "She had good hands to hold," Nadia said. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Yes," in a voice that was about several things at once, and Nadia looked at the garden and felt the warmth of it settle over her like the evening air, gradual and total. The third gift arrived in a box. A coat, deep green wool, perfectly cut, with a small card inside that said only, "You kept giving yours away." Nadia sat on the edge of her bed and held it in her lap and felt something move in her chest that she needed a moment to identify, and then needed another moment to decide what to do with. She put the coat on, just to see, standing in front of the mirror on the back of her door, and it fit as if it had been made for her, which she suspected it had been, and she stood there for longer than was strictly necessary, looking at herself in it, and then she took it off and hung it up and went to find him. He was in his study, standing at the window with his back to the door, and she knocked on the open door and he turned, and she said, "The coat is too much." "It's a coat," he said. "It's a very expensive coat," she said. "It's cold," he said. "Tayo." Nadia. She looked at him across the study, and he looked back at her, and the room had a lot of books in it and a desk and a lamp and several very legitimate reasons for both of them to be looking at something else, and neither of them was. "You're doing a lot," she said, "for someone who doesn't say much." He held her gaze and said, unhurriedly, "I find that doing tends to be more honest than saying." The room was very quiet. Her heart was not particularly quiet. "Good night, Tayo," she said, and turned, and walked back down the corridor, and she pressed her hand flat against the wall for just a moment as she turned the corner because her legs had decided briefly to have opinions. In his study, Tayo stood at the window for a long time after her footsteps faded. Gyeonghui engineered it, and Nadia was almost certain she did it on purpose. She had a way, on her clearer days, of looking between the two of them with the specific, innocent expression of a woman doing absolutely nothing, which Nadia had learned was the expression she wore when she was doing several things. On a Saturday afternoon she told Tayo, in Korean, something that made him look at Nadia. "She wants to go to the night market," he said. "She says she wants you to come and me to drive, because she doesn't trust the regular driver to buy the right rice cakes." Nadia looked at Gyeonghui, who was gazing at the ceiling. "She seems very sure about the rice cakes," Nadia said. "She's very sure about everything, on Saturdays," he said. The night market was warm and loud and smelled of grilled things and sweet things and the specific happiness of a place where everyone had come on purpose to feel good, and Gyeonghui walked through it like she owned it, which on her best days she walked through everything. She stopped at every stall, examined every item with the thoroughness of a quality inspector, tasted 3 different things before buying one, and argued cheerfully with a vendor over rice cakes in a way that seemed to bring both of them considerable joy. Nadia and Tayo walked behind her, a half step back, close enough to be there and far enough to give her the pleasure of her independence. Their arms brushed, once, when Gyeonghui stopped suddenly to investigate a display of silk scarves and they both stopped with her. Neither of them moved apart. They walked the rest of the market like that, close enough that the warmth between their arms was a constant and companionable thing, and neither of them named it and neither of them stopped it, and Gyeonghui selected 3 silk scarves and a rice cake and led them home with the triumphant bearing of a woman whose Saturday had gone exactly as planned. He kissed her on a Wednesday evening, which was not a remarkable evening by any external measure. It was raining lightly. Gyeonghui was inside watching her game show, and they were both standing in the doorway of the garden because neither of them had an umbrella, and the conversation had moved through several things and landed somewhere quiet and close and full. She had been mid-sentence about something she would later be entirely unable to recall, and he had turned to look at her in the particular way he had, the full and unhurried way, and she had looked back, and the sentence had simply run out of words. He lifted his hand and brushed his thumb along her cheekbone, just once, a question in the gesture that was as articulate as anything he'd ever said with words. She answered it by staying very still and looking at him, and he came the rest of the way and kissed her, softly and without hurry, with all the careful deliberateness of a man who had been moving toward this moment for long enough that he intended to be fully present in it. She kissed him back, and the rain came down, and from somewhere inside the house Gyeonghui's game show erupted into cheerful applause, which was either the most absurd timing in the history of romance or the most perfect, and when they broke apart Nadia laughed, full and warm and helpless with it, and he rested his forehead against hers and laughed too, quietly, and it was the first time she had heard him laugh without anything held back. He proposed with his mother present, which Nadia suspected was not an accident. It was a Sunday morning in the garden, the good kind of Sunday with good light and no urgency, and Gyeonghui was doing her crossword with the focused intensity she brought to anything she had decided to conquer, and Tayo set a cup of tea in front of Nadia and then didn't sit back down, and something in the quality of his standing made her look up. He had a box in his hand, small and unassuming, and he looked at her with the expression of a man who ran a large company and could hold a boardroom without effort and was nonetheless working very hard to hold himself together right now. "I had a plan," he said, "for how I was going to do this, and I've decided the plan is terrible." Nadia looked at the box, then at him. "So this is the improvised version," she said. "This is the true version," he said, and crouched down beside her chair, and opened the box, and looked at her, and said, "You came into this house and you protected my mother and you fought for her when I failed to, and somewhere in between all of that I fell in love with you so completely and so irreversibly that I cannot remember what any of this felt like before you were in it." He paused, and something crossed his face that was very human and very earnest and very him. "Nadia, please marry me." She looked at him for a long moment. He waited, which he was better at than he looked. Gyeonghui had put down her crossword. "Yes," Nadia said, simply and completely and with her whole chest, and he put the ring on her finger and stood up and pulled her to her feet and held her face in both hands and kissed her forehead and then her cheek and then her mouth, with the reverence of a man who understood what he had been given. Gyeong-hui said something loud and declarative. They broke apart. She says, Tayo said, his hand still holding Nadia's face, his voice threaded with laughter, that it's about time, and that you still sing like a sad cat, and that the ring is very pretty. Nadia pressed her face against his shoulder and laughed until her ribs hurt. Gyeong-hui picked her crossword back up, satisfied, as though she had simply been waiting for them to catch up to something she had already known. The wedding was small and entirely on purpose. 30 people, a room full of white flowers and evening light, music played by a string quartet that Tayo had chosen and Gyeong-hui had approved by listening to 3 options and pointing firmly at her preferred one. Nadia wore a dress that was simple and completely perfect, and she walked without anyone giving her away because she was not something that belonged to be given, and she walked toward him with the steady, unhurried steps of a woman who knew exactly where she was going. He watched her come down the aisle with an expression that he made no effort to compose, and it was the most unguarded she had ever seen him, and she thought it was the most beautiful thing she had seen in her life, and she was not a woman who said things she didn't mean. In the front row, Gyeong-hui sat in a pale pink dress that Mrs. Yoon had helped her choose over 4 separate shopping attempts, with her white hair pinned up and her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on her son and the woman walking toward him. And she smiled. Not the uncertain, searching almost smile of a woman trying to locate herself in a world that kept rearranging itself, but a full and settled and luminous smile, the smile of a woman who knew exactly where she was, and who these people were, and what this moment meant, and was present for all of it. Nadia saw the smile as she reached the end of the aisle and it nearly undid her entirely, and she blinked once, hard, and straightened, and took Tayo's outstretched hand. He squeezed her fingers. She squeezed back. I see you, the gesture said, the way it had said it since a rainy bench on an ordinary street, on a day when neither of them had any idea that the other one existed. The officiant began to speak, and the room held its breath, and in the front row, Gyeong-hui reached into the pocket of her pink dress, produced a butterscotch candy, unwrapped it with the focused deliberateness she brought to important tasks, and put it in her mouth. Mrs. Yoon, seated beside her, pressed her lips together very firmly. Gyeong-hui offered her one. She took it. The end. Thank you so much for watching. Please don't forget to like, subscribe and comment. I love you.